The winter wind howled outside the empty penthouse apartment, but Richard Chen barely noticed it anymore. The stunning view of the city skyline that had once filled him with pride now only reminded him of everything he'd lost. Sitting alone in his home office, he stared at the family photo on his desk, a moment frozen in time from just 2 years ago, when happiness wasn't measured in bank statements and business deals. At 45, Richard had achieved what most would consider the ultimate success story. A self-made tech millionaire who had built his company from scratch, he now owned one of the largest software security firms in the country. But success had come at a devastating price. "Dad, I got accepted into the music program." His daughter Amy's excited voice echoed in his memory. He'd barely looked up from his laptop that day, managing only a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before returning to his endless stream of emails. Now, he couldn't even remember the last time he'd heard her play the piano. The beautiful grand piano he'd bought her still sat untouched in their old family home across town. His wife Linda had tried to warn him. "The kids are growing up so fast, Richard. They need their father, not just his money." But he'd been too consumed by his next big project, the next acquisition, the next milestone. He'd convinced himself that providing them with the best of everything, private schools, luxury vacations, expensive gadgets, was enough. He'd been wrong. The breaking point came during what should have been their family vacation in Bali. Instead of joining them, he'd stayed behind for a crucial merger negotiation. When Linda and the kids returned, something had changed. The light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a resignation that terrified him more than any business crisis ever had. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said quietly one evening, after the kids had gone to bed. "We're not a family anymore, Richard. We're just occupants of the same expensive house, living separate lives. The children barely know their father anymore." He'd tried to argue, to negotiate like he did in his business deals. But this wasn't a business transaction, this was his family slipping through his fingers like sand. Within months, Linda had moved out with their children, Amy and young Michael, to their old family home. The divorce papers followed shortly after. Now, 6 months later, Richard sat in his luxurious but lifeless penthouse, finally understanding the true cost of his ambition. His company's stock price was at an all-time high, but his personal life had hit rock bottom. He hadn't seen his children in weeks. Michael's baseball games and Amy's recitals passed by like ships in the night while he buried himself in work, trying to numb the pain of their absence. But something changed that evening as he looked at that family photo. The happy faces staring back at him sparked a revelation that shook him to his core. All his life, he'd approached problems like a businessman, identifying goals, developing strategies, and executing plans. Why couldn't he apply the same determination to winning back his family? He opened his laptop, but this time it wasn't to check stock prices or read quarterly reports. Instead, he began to type out a different kind of business plan, one that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. This was a plan to rebuild what really mattered. Step 1 was clear: he needed to understand where he'd gone wrong. Not just superficially, but truly comprehend how his single-minded pursuit of success had affected each member of his family. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in years: he canceled all his meetings for the next day. As he worked late into the night, the outline of his plan began to take shape. He wouldn't try to buy his way back into their lives. That approach had failed spectacularly before. This time, he would do what he should have done years ago: listen, understand, and be present. Richard glanced at his watch, 2 a.m. In the past, such late hours were spent poring over contracts and market analyses. Tonight, he was plotting a different kind of future. Tomorrow would be the first day of his most important project yet, not building a business empire, but rebuilding his family. As he finally prepared for bed, he paused by the piano room he'd had installed in the penthouse, a room that had never been used. Amy would have loved it. Maybe, just maybe, she would play here someday. But first, he had to prove to them that he could change, that he understood what really mattered in life. The city lights twinkled below as Richard made a promise to himself and his absent family. He would approach this challenge with the same dedication that had made him a millionaire, but this time, success would be measured in smiles, hugs, and restored relationships, not dollars and cents. The journey ahead would be the hardest thing he'd ever attempted, but for once in his life, failure simply wasn't an option. His family was worth more than all the business success in the world, and it was time he proved it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Richard's office as he sat across from his company's board of directors. The tension in the room was palpable as he made his announcement. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations," he stated firmly, meeting the shocked gazes of his executives. "Effective immediately, I'll be working reduced hours and delegating most of my responsibilities to the management team." The boardroom erupted in concerned murmurs. His CFO, a longtime colleague, leaned forward. "But the Jensen merger is just weeks away." The shareholders, Richard raised his hand, silencing the protests. "The company has a strong leadership team. It's time I trusted them to do their jobs while I focus on something more important, my family." As he walked out of the boardroom, Richard felt lighter than he had in years. His phone buzzed with messages from concerned investors and business partners, but for once, he didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook where he'd written his plan for the day. First on the list was something that should have been simple but felt terrifyingly difficult: calling Linda to ask about the kids. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed her number. When she answered, her voice was cautious, guarded. "Richard? Is everything okay?" "Yes, I just wanted to know how the kids are doing," he managed, his rehearsed speech forgotten. There was a long pause on the other end. "They're fine," Linda replied, her tone neutral. "Michael has a baseball game this weekend, and Amy's preparing for her spring recital." Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to come to both, if that's okay." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure? These aren't board meetings you can reschedule, Richard. They need consistency, not just occasional appearances when it suits your schedule." Her words stung, but they were fair. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm making changes, Linda. Real ones this time. I've stepped back from daily operations at the company. I want to be present, really present, in their lives again." There was a softness in Linda's voice when she finally responded, though still cautious. "Michael's game is Saturday at 2. Don't make promises you can't keep, Richard. They've been disappointed enough." After hanging up, Richard drove to his old neighborhood. Parking across from their family home, he watched as Michael's school bus arrived. His son had grown taller in the months since he'd last seen him properly. The boy's backpack was covered in baseball team patches, details of his life that Richard had missed. As he sat there, a tap on his car window startled him. It was Mrs. Zhang, their elderly neighbor who had lived next door for years. "So, you finally came," she said after he rolled down the window. Her direct gaze held no judgment, just observation. "You know, my late husband was like you, always working. He realized too late that time is the one thing money can't buy back." Richard nodded, her words hitting home. "I'm trying to fix things," he said softly. Mrs. Zhang smiled gently. "Then stop sitting in your car and go talk to your son. Sometimes the hardest steps are the most important ones." Gathering his courage, Richard got out of the car. Michael was shooting baskets in the driveway, his movements showing a grace and skill that seemed to have developed overnight. When he spotted his father, the basketball froze in his hands. "Dad?" Michael's voice cracked slightly, a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Hey, buddy," Richard replied, his heart racing. "I was hoping we could talk for a bit." Michael looked toward the house, then back at his father. "Mom said you've been busy with work." Too busy, Richard admitted. But that's changing. I heard you have a game this weekend. Michael's face lit up slightly before he caught himself, guarding his enthusiasm. Yeah. We're playing the Hawks. They're top of the league. Would you show me some of your moves? Richard asked hesitantly. For a moment, he thought Michael would refuse, but then the boy nodded, tossing him the ball. What followed was 30 minutes of Michael demonstrating his layups and jump shots, with Richard's clumsy attempts to keep up drawing reluctant smiles from his son. As they played, Richard noticed Amy watching from her bedroom window. When their eyes met, she quickly disappeared behind the curtain. One step at a time, he reminded himself. You can't fix years of absence in a single afternoon. That evening, back in his penthouse, Richard didn't turn on his laptop. Instead, he researched youth baseball strategies and watched videos about supporting young musicians. He ordered books on rebuilding family relationships and made appointments with a family counselor, not for them yet, but for himself. He needed to understand how to be the father his children deserved. His phone kept buzzing with work notifications, each one a temptation to fall back into old habits. But next to his desk sat a new photo frame, one holding a slightly blurry picture he'd managed to snap of Michael mid-jump shot that afternoon. It wasn't perfectly framed or professionally taken like the corporate headshots that usually surrounded him, but it was real, present, alive. As night fell over the city, Richard added more notes to his family reconnection plan. He'd learned in business that sustainable change requires structure and commitment. He mapped out potential activities with each child, ways to support their interests, and most importantly, how to be consistently present in their lives. The last entry in his notebook for the day read, "Success metric, not how many deals closed, but how many moments shared." It wasn't going to be easy. Years of damaged trust couldn't be repaired overnight. But as he looked at the small victory of that afternoon's basketball session, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in his recent business successes, genuine hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Amy's silence was a wound that needed gentle healing. Linda's cautious responses showed the walls he'd have to carefully navigate. But for the first time in years, Richard was fighting for something more valuable than market share or profit margins. He was fighting for the priceless chance to be a father again. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made Richard think perhaps the universe was finally on his side. He arrived at Michael's baseball game 45 minutes early, watching from his car as other parents set up lawn chairs and coolers. In the past, he would have found their casual chatter and community spirit beneath him. Now, he envied their easy familiarity with each other. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the folding chair he'd bought the day before and made his way to the bleachers. Linda was already there, sitting with Amy, who immediately pulled out her phone when she spotted him. He noticed Amy's hair was different, shorter, with subtle blue streaks. When had that happened? How many other changes in his children's lives had he missed? "You're early," Linda said, surprise evident in her voice. Richard settled into his chair, deliberately choosing a spot close enough to show he wanted to be part of the family, but far enough to respect their space. "I didn't want to miss anything," he replied simply. As the teams warmed up, Richard watched Michael practicing with his teammates. His son's face was focused, serious. A coach was showing him how to adjust his batting stance, and Michael nodded attentively. Richard felt a pang of regret, that should have been him teaching his son these things. The game began, and Richard found himself completely absorbed. When Michael stepped up to bat in the third inning, Richard's heart was pounding harder than during any business presentation. The pitch came fast, and Michael connected with a solid crack. As the ball soared toward left field, Richard jumped to his feet, cheering. He wasn't alone. Amy had also stood up, her phone forgotten as she shouted encouragement to her brother. For a brief moment, their eyes met in shared excitement before she quickly looked away, remembering she was supposed to be distant with him. Michael made it to second base, and Richard saw his son scanning the crowd. When their eyes met, Richard gave him a thumbs up, and Michael's answering smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. In that moment, Richard understood what he'd been missing while chasing millions, the pure joy of watching your child succeed at something they love. After the game, Michael's team won 7-5, Richard hesitated, then approached his family. "Great game, buddy," he said to Michael, who was still flushed with victory. "That hit in the third inning was incredible." "You saw that?" Michael asked, then caught himself, trying to sound casual. "I mean, yeah, Coach Lee has been helping me with my swing." Richard noticed Linda watching their interaction carefully, her expression thoughtful. "I was wondering," Richard said, addressing all of them but particularly looking at Amy, "if you'd like to get ice cream to celebrate?" Amy's fingers tightened around her phone, but before she could respond, Michael burst out, "Can we go to Dairy Dream?" "Please, Mom." Linda looked at her children, then at Richard. "I suppose we could," she said carefully. "If everyone wants to." Amy shrugged, which wasn't a no, and Richard's heart leaped. At the ice cream parlor, Richard watched as Michael enthusiastically described every play of the game. Amy sat quietly, stirring her strawberry sundae, but he noticed she was listening. When Michael mentioned his upcoming science project about renewable energy, Richard saw an opening. "You know," he said casually, "my company has been working with some interesting solar technology. If you're interested, I could." He trailed off as he saw Linda's warning look. He was falling back into old patterns, trying to solve everything with his business connections. "I mean," he corrected himself, "maybe we could look up some experiments online and try them together? If you want." Michael's eyes lit up. "Could we build a solar-powered car? Tommy's dad helped him make one last semester." "I'd like that," Richard said softly, meaning it more than any business deal he'd ever closed. He glanced at Amy, who was now typing something on her phone. "How about you, Amy? How's your music going?" The table fell silent. Amy looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time that day. "Oh, now you care about my music?" Her voice was quiet but sharp. "I stopped playing 6 months ago." "But you wouldn't know that, would you?" Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You stopped? But you loved playing." Amy's laugh was bitter. "Yeah, I did. I loved it when Mom came to my recitals. I loved it when Mrs. Zhang brought cookies and sat in the front row. I even loved it when Michael complained about having to listen to me practice. But playing for an empty house? Not so much." Linda placed a gentle hand on Amy's arm, but their daughter wasn't finished. "You know what the worst part was? When I decided to quit, I waited 2 weeks to tell you. I thought maybe you'd notice there was no more music in the house. But you didn't even realize." Richard's throat felt tight. "Amy, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. So wrong. But if you still love music." Amy stood up abruptly. "I'm going to wait in the car." As she walked away, Richard noticed she'd barely touched her ice cream. "Give her time," Linda said quietly after Michael went to look at the flavors display. "She's hurt, Richard. She idolized you when she was little. The fall was harder for her." Richard nodded, fighting back tears. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. Linda's expression softened slightly. "Maybe start by not trying to fix it. Just be there. Listen. Show up. Not just once or twice, but consistently. They need to know you're not going to disappear again when work calls." Later that night, alone in his penthouse, Richard sat at his desk. Instead of checking emails or stock reports, he was looking at old videos on his phone, recordings of Amy's recitals that he'd taken but never found time to watch. The music flowed from his phone speakers, his daughter's talent obvious even to his untrained ear. In every video, there was an empty seat in the front row, his seat. He opened his laptop and began researching. Not business proposals or market trends, but piano lessons for adults. If Amy ever found her way back to music, he wanted to understand her passion. And if she didn't, well, maybe learning about something she had once loved would help him understand the daughter he wanted so desperately to know again. As midnight approached, Richard added a new note to his journal: success isn't measured in quarters or fiscal years. It's measured in the moments you choose to be present for. Today, one baseball game, one ice cream conversation, one hard truth from Amy. Small steps on a long road home. 2 weeks after the baseball game, Richard sat in his first piano lesson, feeling oddly vulnerable. His instructor, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Wu, watched with infinite patience as Richard struggled through basic scales. Music, Mr. Wu said thoughtfully, is not about perfection. It's about expression. About showing what's in your heart. Richard thought about Amy, about all the recitals where that empty front row seat had spoken louder than any melody. He'd been attending Michael's baseball games regularly now, learning the other parents' names, becoming part of that community. But Amy remained distant, a wall of hurt between them that seemed insurmountable. That evening, as he was leaving the office early, another new habit he was cultivating, his phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Emergency at work. Can't pick up kids from school activities. Michael has baseball practice until 5, Amy's staying late for yearbook committee. Can you help? Richard's heart raced as he typed back an immediate yes. Then he noticed the calendar notification for an important investor call scheduled for 4:30. In the past, this wouldn't have been a choice at all. Now, he took a deep breath and sent another message, this time to his executive team, rescheduling the call. He arrived at the baseball field first, watching the end of Michael's practice from the bleachers. His son's face lit up when he saw him, and Richard felt a warmth that no business success had ever provided. Dad! Coach Lee taught me a new pitching technique. Want to see? Definitely, Richard smiled, but we need to pick up your sister first. Maybe we can practice in the backyard this weekend? The easy way Michael nodded, taking it for granted that his father would be there, marked a small but significant victory. The drive to Amy's school was quiet, Michael tired from practice. When they pulled up, Amy was sitting on the steps with her friend Lily, both girls hunched over a laptop. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before the now familiar mask of indifference settled back in. Mom had a work emergency, Richard explained as Amy approached the car. I thought maybe we could grab dinner. He saw her hesitate, glancing back at Lily. We're working on the senior section layout, she said. It's due tomorrow. Lily could come too, Richard offered, the words out before he could second-guess them. If that's okay with her parents? Both girls looked startled, but after a quick phone call for permission, they were all headed to the local diner that Richard remembered Amy loving as a child. Over burgers and fries, Richard listened as Amy and Lily discussed their yearbook project. He learned more about his daughter's life in those 30 minutes than he had in the past year. She was the layout editor, responsible for design decisions. She'd fought to include more candid photos instead of just formal poses, wanting to capture real moments. That's what makes memories special, Amy said, passionate about her point. Not the staged stuff, but the real moments. Like. She trailed off, and Richard knew she was thinking about those piano recitals, about all the real moments he'd missed. Like Michael's baseball games, he said quietly. The unexpected double plays, the victory celebrations, the way the whole team comes together. Amy looked at him sharply, perhaps hearing the regret in his voice. Lily, seeming to sense the underlying tension, skillfully steered the conversation to their upcoming graduation. Richard learned that Amy had been accepted to several colleges but hadn't made her final decision yet. Another major life event he'd been absent from. Where are you thinking of going? He asked carefully. Amy stirred her milkshake, not meeting his eyes. "I got into Berkeley's journalism program," she said finally. "And Northwestern. Mom's been helping me compare them." Richard fought back the urge to immediately offer opinions or solutions. Instead, he asked, "What draws you to journalism?" For the first time in weeks, Amy looked directly at him, really looked at him. "I want to tell stories that matter. Help people's voices be heard. Make sure important things don't get overlooked." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Richard nodded slowly. "That sounds meaningful. Important." He paused, then added, "I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking, whenever you're willing to share." After dropping Lily off, the car ride home was quiet but less tense than usual. As they pulled up to the house, Amy spoke unexpectedly. "There's a yearbook showcase next week. The staff presents our work to the school board." She got out of the car quickly, but Richard heard the unspoken invitation in her words. That night, in his penthouse, Richard made two decisions. First, he emailed his assistant to clear his schedule for the yearbook showcase. Second, he began researching journalism programs, not to influence Amy's decision, but to understand the world she was choosing to enter. As he worked through his piano exercises later that evening, his clumsy fingers finding the keys in the quiet room, Richard thought about Mr. Wu's words about expression and heart. Maybe that's what he'd been doing wrong all along, trying to show his love through success and financial security instead of through presence and understanding. He'd missed so many of Amy's recitals, thinking his absence would be forgotten in the face of the opportunities his success could provide. But children don't want opportunities as much as they want their parents' attention, their time, their genuine interest in their lives. Looking at his calendar, Richard noted Michael's next game, the yearbook showcase, and his piano lesson. His business calendar was emptier these days, but somehow his life felt fuller. The company's stock had dropped 5 points after news of his reduced role went public, but watching Michael demonstrate his pitching technique had been worth more than those lost millions. He opened his journal, adding a new entry: "Real wealth isn't measured in bank balances. It's measured in the way your son's eyes light up when he sees you in the bleachers, in the moment your daughter actually looks at you instead of through you, in the small chances you get to show them that they matter more than any business deal ever could." As he got ready for bed, his phone buzzed with a text from Amy: "The showcase is next Thursday at 7. Don't be late." Simple words, but they felt like the first brick being removed from the wall between them. Richard typed back a reply, choosing his words carefully: "I'll be there. Thank you for letting me know." He set 3 alarms for next Thursday, knowing that being on time wasn't enough. He needed to be early, to show that this mattered, that she mattered. The road to rebuilding trust was long, but for the first time, he felt like he might actually be on the right path. Thursday evening arrived with a persistent drizzle that turned the city streets into rivers of reflected neon. Richard arrived at the school 45 minutes early, his heart pounding as if he were about to give a keynote speech to thousands. In many ways, this was more important. He'd changed his suit 3 times before settling on a modest charcoal gray, wanting to look presentable but not overdressed like the business tycoon he used to be. The school auditorium was already buzzing with activity when he entered. Students were setting up display boards, parents were finding seats, and teachers were organizing programs. Richard spotted Linda near the front, talking with another parent. She looked surprised but pleased to see him so early. "You made it," she said as he approached. "Amy's backstage with the other editors. She's nervous, though she won't admit it." Richard nodded, fighting the urge to go find Amy and offer reassurance. He was learning that sometimes supporting his children meant giving them space to handle things on their own. As they waited for the showcase to begin, Linda filled him in on recent events he'd missed. Michael had aced his science test. Amy had been helping to tutor younger students in photography. Small details of his children's lives that he was gradually becoming part of again. She posted about the showcase on Instagram. Linda mentioned casually, Tagged both of us in it. Richard's throat tightened. He'd noticed Amy had unblocked him on social media recently but hadn't dared to comment on any of her posts yet. The lights dimmed, and the school principal began her introduction. Richard sat straighter in his chair as Amy walked onto the stage with her fellow editors. She wore a professional-looking blazer he'd never seen before, her blue-streaked hair neatly styled. When had his little girl grown up so much? Amy stepped up to the microphone, and Richard held his breath. A yearbook isn't just a collection of photos, she began, her voice clear and confident. It's a time capsule of moments that matter. This year, our team decided to focus on capturing the real story of our school community, not just the big events, but the small moments that make up who we are. As she spoke, images began appearing on the screen behind her. Students studying together in the library. A teacher staying late to help with math problems. The baseball team, including Michael, celebrating a victory. Each photo told a story, just as Amy had said. We wanted to show that every person's story matters, Amy continued. That sometimes the most important moments aren't the ones we plan for, but the ones that happen when we're simply showing up, being present, being real. Richard felt Linda's eyes on him, but he couldn't look away from his daughter. Was she speaking just about the yearbook, or was there a message for him in her words? The next photo appeared on screen. It was Michael's recent baseball game, a candid shot of the whole family at the ice cream parlor afterward. Richard hadn't even noticed Amy taking it. After the presentation, as parents and students mingled around the display boards, Richard studied every page of the yearbook preview carefully. Amy's influence was clear in the layout, in the way each spread told a story beyond just faces and names. What do you think? Amy's voice behind him made him turn. She was trying to sound casual, but he could hear the hint of uncertainty. It's extraordinary, he said honestly. You have a real talent for seeing the stories behind the moments. A small smile tugged at her lips. Really? You're not just saying that? Richard shook his head. No, I mean it. I especially like how you captured the baseball game. The way you showed not just the plays, but the community around it. That was actually one of the last photos we added, Amy admitted. I almost didn't include it, but Lily said it fit our theme of unexpected moments. She paused, then added quietly, I didn't expect you to keep coming to the games. I know, Richard said softly. I've given you plenty of reasons not to trust my promises. But I'm trying to change that, one day at a time. Amy nodded, looking down at the yearbook pages. I noticed, she said simply. Before either of them could say more, Amy's fellow editors called her over to meet with the school board members. As she walked away, Richard noticed she was wearing the ballet flats Linda had bought her for her last piano recital. Some part of her still held on to those musical memories. Later that evening, after the showcase ended and congratulations were shared, Richard found himself walking to his car beside Linda. She did amazingly well, he said, still proud and a little awestruck. Linda smiled. She's always been good at seeing the truth in things. Even when it's hard to look at. I kept all her piano recital programs, Richard admitted suddenly. In my desk drawer at work. I used to tell myself I'd watch the recordings during lunch breaks, catch up on what I'd missed. But I never did. Linda's expression softened. The past is past, Richard. What matters is what you're doing now. As if to punctuate her words, his phone buzzed with a notification. Amy had posted a new photo on Instagram, a behind-the-scenes shot of the yearbook team celebrating after the showcase. He was visible in the background, looking at the displays. She had tagged him again. That night, in his penthouse, Richard sat at his piano. His fingers found the keys of the simple melody Mr. Wu had been teaching him. It wasn't anything like the complex pieces Amy used to play, but as he pressed each key deliberately, he thought about her words from the showcase. About showing up, being present, being real. He opened his laptop, not to check company emails but to look at college websites. Berkeley and Northwestern both had strong journalism programs, but they also had something else in common: excellent music departments. Not that he would mention this to Amy. Her path forward was hers to choose. But maybe, just maybe, music would find its way back into her life someday. Before going to bed, he added to his journal, "Success today, showed up early. Listened instead of talking. Saw my daughter shine. Learned that sometimes the best way to rebuild a bridge is to simply stand steady on your side, ready to meet them when they're ready to take a step forward." As he drifted off to sleep, the sound of distant piano music floated through his dreams, not the complex pieces Amy used to play, but something simpler, newer, like fresh shoots growing through old ground. The crisis hit on a sunny Tuesday morning, just hours before Michael's championship baseball game. Richard was in his downsized office, reviewing college brochures for both Berkeley and Northwestern, still not to influence Amy's decision, but to understand her world better, when his CFO burst in without knocking. "The Jensen merger is falling apart," he announced, his face ashen. "They're threatening to pull out completely. The stock is already down 12%, and if word gets out about Jensen, we could lose half our market value by tomorrow." 6 months ago, this would have been Richard's worst nightmare. Now, as he glanced at the baseball cap sitting on his desk, the one Michael had given him, decorated with the team's colors, his priorities crystallized with surprising clarity. "What do they want?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The CFO spread documents across his desk, pointing to figures and projections. "They're demanding a face-to-face emergency meeting. Today. In Chicago. The corporate jet is ready." Richard looked at his watch. 11:30 a.m. Michael's game was at 4 p.m. Even if he left immediately, there was no way he could do both. The old Richard would have already been halfway to the airport, firing off a quick apologetic text to his family. "No," he said simply. His CFO stared at him as if he'd started speaking in tongues. "What do you mean, no?" "Richard, this is everything we've worked for. The whole Jensen acquisition has been your baby from the start." Richard stood up, his voice firm but calm. "Call an emergency board meeting. Virtual, not in person. I want everyone online in 30 minutes. As his CFO hurried out, Richard pulled out his phone and did something that would have been unthinkable months ago. He called Linda. "Can we talk to Michael together?" he asked after explaining the situation. "I want him to hear this from me, in person, not through a text." There was a long pause before Linda agreed. 20 minutes later, they sat with Michael in the school cafeteria. Richard had expected to see disappointment in his son's eyes. Instead, he saw something worse: resignation, as if this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "It's okay, Dad," Michael said, trying to sound grown-up. "I understand. Work is important." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, because he recognized the tone. It was the same one he'd used countless times, prioritizing business over family. "No," Richard said firmly, surprising both Michael and Linda. "You're important. This game is important. I promised I'd be there, and I'm going to be there." Michael's eyes widened. "But, your company has an excellent leadership team that I trust to handle this," Richard finished. He met Linda's gaze, seeing a mix of surprise and something else: respect, maybe? "I've missed too many moments already, buddy. I'm not missing this one." The virtual board meeting was tense. Richard laid out his plan clearly. Their legal team would draft new proposals, the executive team would handle preliminary negotiations, and he would fly to Chicago first thing tomorrow morning. "The Jensen team won't like this," someone warned. Richard nodded. "Then they'll have to not like it. I have a prior commitment that I'm not breaking." He ended the call amid a flurry of concerned messages, turned off his phone, and headed to the baseball field. The championship game was everything a father could hope to witness. Michael pitched 3 solid innings, his form showing all the practice they'd put in together. In the final inning, with 2 outs and runners on base, Michael stepped up to bat. Richard gripped the bleacher seat, his heart racing. The pitch came fast, and Michael swung, a clean hit that sent the ball soaring over the infield. As Michael ran to first base, Richard was on his feet, cheering. He looked over to see Amy recording the moment on her phone, actually smiling. They won the championship. In the celebration that followed, Richard found himself pulled into team photos, surrounded by other parents he now knew by name. Michael's grin was brighter than any success Richard had ever achieved in business. That evening, Linda suggested they all go out to dinner to celebrate. At the restaurant, Michael couldn't stop reliving every play of the game. Amy actually joined in, showing them the video she'd taken of his winning hit. "Dad," Michael said suddenly, growing serious. "Thanks for staying. I mean, for choosing to come to the game instead of going to Chicago." Richard put down his fork, giving his son his full attention. "There wasn't really a choice to make, buddy. Some things are more important than business deals. Even $1 million ones?" Amy asked quietly. It wasn't asked with her usual edge, she seemed genuinely curious. Richard looked at both his children, then at Linda. "Even $1 billion ones," he said firmly. "Because no amount of money can buy back moments like today." Later that night, after returning to his penthouse, Richard finally turned his phone back on. The messages and missed calls flooded in, the stock had dropped another 8%, the business press was speculating wildly about the Jensen deal, and his board was panicking. He handled each crisis methodically, the way he used to handle family obligations, efficiently but without letting it consume him. Around midnight, an email came in from Jensen's CEO, "Heard you chose your kid's baseball game over our meeting. Respect. Let's talk tomorrow, my son plays baseball too." Richard smiled, adding a new entry to his journal: lost, potentially millions in stock value, several hours of sleep, and maybe a few gray hairs. Gained, saw my son's championship victory, heard my daughter laugh, felt like a real father. Best trade I've ever made. As he got ready for bed, his phone buzzed with one last notification. Amy had posted on Instagram again, a series of photos from the game and dinner. The caption read, "Championship victory, family dinner, and some surprises along the way. Sometimes people can change." She had tagged him again. Looking out at the city lights, Richard thought about how different his view of success was now. The Jensen deal still mattered, he'd handle it tomorrow with the same skill he'd built his company with. But it didn't matter more than his children's trust, than being the father they deserved. He set his alarm for early the next morning. He had a flight to Chicago to catch, but also a promise to help Michael pack up his baseball gear for the season. Some might call it inefficient time management. Richard called it getting his priorities right, finally. 3 months had passed since the championship game, and summer was in full swing. Richard stood in his penthouse, surrounded by moving boxes. The space that had once symbolized his success now felt too big, too empty, too far from what really mattered. The Jensen deal had closed successfully last month, but that wasn't what occupied his thoughts as he packed up his home office. Instead, he was thinking about Amy's graduation ceremony tomorrow, and the surprise he'd been planning with Linda's help. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael: "Dad, don't forget we're meeting at the park at 5 for baseball practice." Richard smiled, remembering how their weekend practice sessions had become a constant in both their lives. He'd even started coaching the junior league team, something that brought him more satisfaction than any board meeting ever had. As he taped up another box, his eyes fell on the family photo that had once haunted him with memories of what he'd lost. Now it sat beside a newer photo, one from Michael's championship game, showing all 4 of them smiling at the restaurant afterward. Not a perfect family, but one that was healing. The doorbell rang, and Richard opened it to find Mr. Wu, his piano teacher. "Ready for our last lesson in this space?" the elderly man asked, stepping inside. Richard had continued his piano studies, not because he had any illusions of becoming accomplished, but because it helped him understand the world Amy had loved. As they sat at the piano, Mr. Wu observed, "You've changed since our first lesson. Your music, it has heart now." Richard thought about that as he played the simple piece they'd been working on. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed such sentiment as meaningless. Now he understood. After the lesson, Richard drove to his new house, a modest but warm home just a few blocks from where Linda lived with the kids. He'd bought it not to impress anyone, but because it had a room perfect for Michael's baseball trophies and, more importantly, a space that could become a music room, if Amy ever wanted it. The graduation ceremony the next day was a blur of emotions. Richard sat between Linda and Michael, watching as Amy walked across the stage to receive her diploma. When she gave her speech as yearbook editor, her words struck a chord deep within him. "Life isn't about the perfect moments we plan," she said, looking out at the crowd. "It's about the real moments we choose to show up for. Sometimes the best chapters of our story come after what we thought was the ending." After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and congratulations, Amy approached Richard holding something behind her back. "I have something for you," she said, her voice uncertain but determined. "I found it while cleaning my room for college." She handed him a slightly worn program, from her last piano recital, the one he'd missed. Richard's hands trembled as he took it. "I kept all of them," he said quietly. "Every program, every recording. I was too focused on the wrong things to actually be there." "I know," Amy said. "Mom told me about your piano lessons." She paused, then added, maybe when I'm home from college for breaks, we could play together sometimes. I mean, if you want to. Your pieces would be simpler than mine, but..." Richard swallowed hard, nodding. "I'd like that very much." He hesitated, then said, "Speaking of college, I have something to show you. Both of you," he added, including Michael who had wandered over. He led them to his car, Linda following with a knowing smile. The drive to his new house was quiet, filled with curious glances from his children. When they pulled up, Amy's eyes widened. "This is just a few blocks from home," she said, then caught herself. Their old home was still home to her. Inside, Richard gave them a tour, enjoying their surprise at the modesty of the place compared to his penthouse. He'd furnished it simply but warmly, with spaces that reflected his new priorities. Michael's eyes lit up at the room with space for his sports equipment and a wall perfect for his trophies. Finally, Richard led them to a closed door. "This room, well, it could be anything," he said, looking at Amy. "A study, a library, or..." He opened the door to reveal a space with perfect acoustics, large windows letting in natural light, and in the center, a beautiful upright piano. "It's not a grand piano like the one at the old house," he said quickly. "But I thought, if you ever wanted to play again, or even if you just wanted a quiet place to work on your journalism pieces." Amy walked into the room slowly, her fingers trailing along the piano's surface. "You bought a house with a music room? Even after I quit playing?" Richard shook his head. "I bought a house with a room for whatever you need it to be. Music, writing, thinking, just being. The piano is there if you want it, but no pressure." To everyone's surprise, Amy sat at the piano bench and lifted the cover. Her fingers found the keys, and a simple melody, one of the first pieces she'd ever learned, filled the room. It wasn't perfect, months without practice had left their mark. But it was real. After a few moments, she stopped, wiping her eyes. "I missed it," she admitted quietly. I couldn't play when it felt like I was playing for an empty room." Richard understood. "You don't have to play for anyone. Just for yourself, if you want to." That evening, they ordered pizza and sat on moving boxes in Richard's half-furnished living room. Michael talked about his plans for summer baseball camp, Amy shared her ideas for stories she wanted to write in college, and Linda stayed for dinner, her presence comfortable rather than strained. As the sun set, casting warm light through the windows, Richard looked at his family, not perfect, not completely healed, but together in a way that felt more genuine than ever before. The stock market would open tomorrow, the business world would continue to spin, but his measure of success had fundamentally changed. Later, after everyone had gone home, Richard sat at his own piano, playing the simple piece he'd practiced with Mr. Wu. On his phone was a notification Amy had posted about the day on Instagram. A photo of the music room, the piano, and her hand on the keys. The caption read, "New chapters don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they sound different too. #FreshStart #family." In his journal, Richard wrote his final entry about this chapter of their journey: "True wealth isn't in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's in the sound of your daughter playing piano again, in your son's laughter echoing through a new home, in the knowledge that showing up matters more than showing off. I lost my family once by choosing the wrong kind of success. I got them back by finally understanding what success really means." He closed the journal and walked to the window. The view wasn't as spectacular as from his penthouse, but he could see the glow of Linda's house a few blocks away, where his children were sleeping. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments to choose between work and family. But now he knew which choices really mattered. The moonlight caught the keys of the piano, and Richard smiled, thinking of Amy's words at graduation. Sometimes the best chapters do come after what we think is the ending. And sometimes, if we're lucky and willing to change, what we thought was an ending turns out to be just the beginning.